Rowan, Normandy, May 30th, 1431. A young woman, barely 19, stands chained to a stake in the old market square. Flames lick her feet. Her crime? Heresy, witchcraft, dressing as a man. But as the smoke rises, so too does a question that has haunted history for centuries. Was Joan of Arc truly a criminal, or the victim of one of history's most calculated and cruel injustices?
Welcome to History's Greatest Crimes. I'm Alana.
And I'm Michael. Today we delve into the fiery ordeal of a figure who became a legend, Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans.
Witnesses to her execution describe a scene of both horror and profound piety. One such account from those present note her final moments, quote, "She listened calmly to the sermon read to her, but then broke down weeping during her own address, in which she forgave her accusers for what they were doing and asked them to pray for her. Several eyewitnesses recalled that she repeatedly screamed the holy name of Jesus and implored the aid of the saints until her head drooped and she was gone," end quote.
The executioner himself, a man named Geoffrey Terrage, reported, quote, "greatly feared being damned because he had burned a saint," end quote. This immediate reaction, this fear from the man tasked with her death, tells us something profound. The English authorities, nervous about the sentiment, quickly moved to punish those who spoke in her favor. It suggests that the official narrative of Joan as a justly condemned heretic wasn't universally accepted, not even in moments following her death. The crime was contested from the very smoke and ashes of her pyre.
This sets the stage for our entire inquiry. Was the crime Joan's alleged heresy, or was the true criminality embedded in the very process that led to the stake?
To understand Joan and the crimes she was accused of, we have to plunge into the brutal realities of 15th century France. The Hundred Years' War had been raging between the kingdoms of England and France since 1337, and it was destined to go on until 1453, making the name of the war a misnomer since it actually lasted 116 years in total. This was the longest and widest ranging military conflict since Rome's wars with Carthage in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE.
Now, to be clear, the Hundred Years' War wasn't a continuous war in which people fought without stopping. Rather, it was a series of occasional battles that took place between varying lengths of truces between France and England. But even though it wasn't continuous, the war was still a big deal to people who experienced it.
So what caused this super long war then, Elena?
In short, the Hundred Years' War was about power and land. In the 1300s, the King of England was not only the ruler of England, but also the Duke of a small region in eastern France called Gascony. The kings of England had come to control this region when King Henry II of England married Eleanor of Aquitaine back in 1152, through which England acquired her French territory, which included Gascony. But fast forward to the 1330s, when the King of France died without an heir, the current King Edward of England was actually the deceased French king's closest male relative. But there was no way the French nobility was going to stand for an English king on the French throne. Instead, they chose a French relative more distantly related, this was Philip VI, to be the new King of France.
Let me guess, King Edward of England wasn't happy with this turn of events.
That would be correct, Michael. King Edward of England refused to recognize the authority of the new French king, which prompted King Philip of France to seize Gascony and announce that it now belonged to the Kingdom of France. And King Edward of England declared war on France in response.
By the early 1420s, France was on its knees. This is somewhat unexpected since the Kingdom of France was actually richer and had a larger population than that of England. But the English won battles because their soldiers were better disciplined and trained, and they relied heavily on the longbow.
That's right, Michael. The longbow was used by archers to shoot arrows at the enemy, and as indicated by its name, it was quite large, between 5 and 6 feet long, some even longer. This bow could fire arrows almost 300 yards. Furthermore, English archers were able to fire around 20 arrows per minute, and each arrow delivered somewhere between 90 and 130 pounds of force. This was often enough to slide through a knight's armor like a knife in jello.
Due to the superiority of the English army and their weapons, the English actually managed to capture the French king Jean II in battle in the year 1356. The lords of France ultimately gave the English a lot of money to get their king back, and they also had to give even more French territory to the English.
That's pretty bad.
Yep, and it got only worse from there. In 1450, an army of 6,000 English soldiers won a battle against 20,000 French ones due to those famous English archers we mentioned a moment ago. As a result, the current King of England, now Henry V, forced the current French king to give Henry his daughter in marriage and name Henry heir to the French throne.
That's bad news for the former French king's son, Charles of Valois, who was no longer heir to the throne as a result. And he couldn't do much about it because his treasury was so depleted, it was said to hold less than, quote, 4 écus at one point.
In short, France was a fractured kingdom, a land desperate for a savior, for a sign of hope, any hope. And to add to that, the 15th century was already a period where belief in prophecy, mysticism, and direct divine intervention was strong. The widespread suffering and perceived moral failings on all sides led many to believe that God's justice would ultimately manifest, perhaps through unexpected means. Joan's emergence, therefore, wasn't just a random event. It was, in part, a symptom of France's desperation and its readiness to believe in a divinely sent rescuer.
I absolutely agree. Into this cauldron of chaos and yearning stepped Jeanne d'Arc, aka Joan of Arc. Born around 1412 in the small village of Domremy on the borderlands of Champagne and Lorraine, she was the daughter of tenant farmers Jacques d'Arc and Isabella Romay, and by all accounts, grew up an ordinary, illiterate, but deeply pious young woman devoted to the teachings of the Catholic Church.
But around the age of 13, Joan began to experience something far from ordinary. She described it herself during her trial, words that would later be used to condemn her. She stated that, quote, "When I was of the age of 13 years or thereabouts, she did, with her bodily eyes, see Saint Michael come to comfort her, and from time to time also Saint Gabriel. Sometimes also she had seen a great multitude of angels. Since then, Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret have shown themselves to her in bodily form." End quote. These were not fleeting impressions. She claimed to see them, to hear their voices daily, even to kiss and embrace them, to touch them physically.
The messages from these celestial visitors evolved. Initially, they focused on personal piety. As Joan testified, her first voice told her to, quote, govern herself well and go to church often, end quote. But as France's situation worsened, the messages grew more urgent, more specific, and profoundly political. She recounted that, quote, the voice told her twice or thrice a week that she must leave home and go to France, meaning to the Dauphin's court, and that her father knew nothing of her departure, end quote.
Her divine mission, as she came to perceive it, was monumental, quote, to save France by expelling its enemies and to install Charles as its rightful king, end quote. This conviction in a divine mandate, while extraordinary, resonated with a segment of the French population. As scholar Jane-Marie Pinzino notes, there was a prevailing belief that, quote, victory in battle issued from divine justice rather than military power, end quote.
As the English laid siege to Orleans in central France, a strategic keystone, Joan's voices specifically commanded her to save that city and then lead Charles to Reims for his coronation.
Imagine the scene at the court of the Dauphin Charles in Chinon, France, in early 1429. A teenage peasant girl, dressed in men's clothes for the protection on her perilous journey, arrived claiming she had been sent by God to save the kingdom. She had to be incredibly persistent. But Joan didn't give up, and according to historical accounts, she began, quote, attracting a small band of followers who believed her claims to be the virgin who was destined to save France.
Prophecy was potent currency in the 15th century, and the ones that existed laid a fertile ground for Joan. In times of national crisis, with God himself dispatching the archangel Michael to find a Pucella, a maid, aka a young unmarried woman, presumably a virgin, to save France. Joan, it seemed to a desperate few, fit this prophetic mold. She even reportedly convinced Baudricourt, the local magistrate, by accurately predicting a French defeat near Orleans before official news arrived.
After an 11-day journey across enemy territory, Joan finally gained an audience with Charles. Eyewitnesses from the court later recalled her demeanor, quote, "Most illustrious Lord Dauphin, I have come and I am sent in the name of God to bring aid to you and the kingdom," end quote. The most famous story, the one that seemed to have swayed Charles, was her revelation of a secret prayer he had made to God, details only he could know. One account stated, quote, "After hearing her, the king appeared radiant." Quote.
These signs were critical. In a society where divine intervention was considered a tangible reality, such proofs lent immense credibility to her claims, especially for a leader as beleaguered as Charles. The court theologians, though cautious, found nothing inherently heretical in her initial statements and, seeing little to lose, suggested sending her to Orleans as a test of her divine mission. The very thing that would later be twisted into heretical crime, her claim to divine revelation, was, in this initial phase, her greatest asset.
Charles, against the advice of most of his counselors, took the gamble. He granted Joan an army. She was equipped with white armor. She also had an ancient sword that was famously discovered through Joan's direction buried beneath an altar in the local church. And she had a white banner emblazoned with the names of Jesus and Mary and an image of Christ in judgment. In late April 1429, she arrived at the besieged city of Orleans. And Joan's image and impact was electric. Contemporary accounts describe her presence galvanizing the demoralized French troops. Joan was no mere figurehead. She was an active participant, demanding offensive action from seasoned commanders like Jean, Count of Dunois, the Bastard of Orleans. As his nickname suggested, he was related to the royal family through illegitimate means, but he held considerable influence with Prince Charles. And this confidence is also evident in the first ultimatum she issued to English commanders around March 22nd, before her armies even reached Orleans and faced the English armies.
I love the wording of her ultimatum. It said, quote, "King of England and you, Duke of Bedford, who call yourself regent of the kingdom of France, render account to the King of Heaven. Surrender to the maid who is sent here by God, the King of Heaven, the keys of all the good towns that you have taken and violated in France. King of England, if you do not do these things, I am the commander of the military. And in whatever place I shall find your men in France, I will make them flee the country. She comes sent by the King of Heaven to take you out of France," end quote.
By that time in mid-March 1429, the siege of Orleans had already dragged on for a grueling 210 days. Located in central France, south of Paris, the city of Orleans was the last obstacle for the successful English campaign into central France. And many believe that whoever controlled Orleans, the English or the French, that's who would win the war. So this was an incredibly important battle.
But then Joan of Arc arrived with French armies, and 9 days later, on May 8th of 1429, the siege was lifted in favor of the French. During the decisive assault on the English, Joan, true to her own prediction, was wounded by an arrow between her neck and shoulder. Apparently, she had told her confessor the day before that, quote, "Tomorrow, blood will flow from my body above my breast," end quote. Yet, she apparently quickly returned to fight, her banner in hand, her famous cry, quote, "In God's name, charge boldly," inspiring the French to a stunning victory.
Joan's primary military contribution, particularly at Orleans, seems to have been less about conventional tactical genius and more about her extraordinary ability to inspire and embody divine approval. In an era where battles were often viewed as trials by combat, subject to God's will, a figure believed to be divinely sent, leading the religious symbols and unshakable conviction, had an immeasurable psychological impact. Her wounding and ability to continue fighting could also have been interpreted as sent by God and miraculous.
This success, however, made her an even greater abomination to the English. English leaders did not deny Joan's supernatural power, but they attribute it to the devil rather than God and his saints.
Orleans was a monumental victory, but for Joan, it was only the first step. Her divine mission, as she understood it, included seeing Charles formally crowned at Reims, the traditional site for the consecration of French kings, located deep within now enemy-held territory in northeastern France. This was not just a military objective, but a profoundly symbolic act of legitimization.
The Loire campaign was the first step towards that goal as French armies moved northward. Volunteers of men and supplies swelled the French army, eager to serve under Joan of Arc's banner. One by one, English strongholds fell.
The campaign culminated in the Battle of Patay on June 18, 1429. An English reinforcement army rushed from Paris to stop Joan and her forces. But the English army suffered a paralyzing defeat, during which their framed longbowmen were overwhelmed. This was the first significant field victory for French forces in many years.
Joan's influence was again pivotal. She persuaded a hesitant Prince Charles to press the advantage and advance on Reims when many of his counselors advised caution.
On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was solemnly crowned and anointed King of France at Reims Cathedral, with Joan in full armor and bearing her standard at his side.
The contemporary poet Christine de Pizan, who had been writing from the seclusion of an abbey, broke her long silence to compose the tale of Joan of Arc, the only significant literary work about Joan written during her lifetime. It captures the elation and wonder of the moment. Quote, "And you, Charles, now the King of France, the seventh king of that great name, who earlier suffered such mischance, you thought the future held more shame, but by God's grace, now look how Joan has raised your fame on high. Oh, see, your enemies before you bow. This is a welcome novelty," end quote.
The coronation at Reims was a symbolic apex of Joan's perceived mission. It powerfully legitimized Charles VII as the King of France, and by direct extension, the coronation also validated Joan's divine guidance in the eyes of a significant portion of the French populace.
However, this very triumph solidified her status as an intolerable political and ideological threat to the English. If Joan was truly sent by God, as her string of victories seemed to indicate to the French, then the English cause was, by implication, opposed by God. This made discrediting Joan and the divine source of her power an urgent political necessity for her enemies. Her crime, therefore, had to be framed as an offense against God and the Church to undermine the very legitimacy she had bestowed upon Charles VII of France. Indeed, a key English motive for her later trial was precisely to illegitimize King Charles' crowning by associating him with a heretic. In July of 1429, everything seemed to be going Joan's way. The French armies, with Joan at the lead, had been successful in multiple important battles, and the French prince had been crowned King Charles VII.
After the coronation at Reims, Joan, brimming with confidence, urged an immediate attack on the city of Paris, which was still under the control of the English and their allies. But King Charles VII, now crowned, began to waver. Some of the king's courtiers warned him that Joan was becoming too powerful, perhaps too independent.
The assault on Paris in September of 1429 was a bloody failure. Joan herself was wounded in the thigh by a crossbow bolt while trying to rally her men. This defeat significantly damaged her prestige.
One contemporary chronicle reflecting a pro-English Parisian viewpoint offered a scathing account of the aftermath. The anonymous author writes that the retreating French soldiers, quote, cursed their maid bitterly, for she had promised them that Paris would certainly fall to their assault, that she would sleep there that night, and so would they all, that they would all be made rich with the city's wealth, and anyone who resisted would be cut down or burned in his house, end quote.
Despite the setback, Joan continued to fight. In the spring of 1430, she rushed with a small force of volunteers to the defense of a French town north of Paris. It was currently being besieged by Burgundian forces under Philip the Good, who was allied with the English. On May 23rd, during a daring sortie from the town, Joan was cut off. Accounts suggest that the town's drawbridge may have been raised prematurely. Whether by mistake or design is debated, but this trapped her and her rear guard outside. She was pulled from her horse by a Burgundian archer and captured.
One Burgundian chronicler recorded the elation of Joan's captors. The English and Burgundians were, quote, rejoiced and more pleased than if they had taken 500 other combatants, for they dreaded no other leader or captain so much as they had hitherto feared the maid.
In stark contrast, King Charles VII, the man whose crown Joan had helped to secure, made no attempts to save her.
Charles VII's failure to ransom or even attempt to rescue Joan speaks volume about the brutal political calculus of the era. Having served her primary purpose, his coronation, Joan, with her claims of direct divine authority and her immense popularity, may have become then politically inconvenient, maybe even a threat, to the king and his council.
The Archbishop of Reims, Renaud Deschartres, who had initially supported her, even now accused her of acting willfully and rejecting counsel after her capture. It seemed that the crime Joan was about to be tried for by her enemies was, in a way, facilitated by that calculated inaction of those she had so fervently served. And her capture was a golden opportunity for the English to neutralize a potent symbol and a feared military adversary.
Joan was initially a prisoner of war held by John of Luxembourg, a vassal of the Duke of Burgundy, ally of the King of England. But the English wanted her, and they wanted her tried by the Church. The University of Paris, at the time a staunchly pro-English institution, quickly wrote to the Duke of Burgundy urging him to turn Joan over to the Inquisition or to Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais.
Bishop Cauchon was a key figure. He was a zealous supporter of the English cause, and Joan had been captured within his ecclesiastical diocese of Beauvais in northern France, giving him a claim to jurisdiction. He would ultimately be the chief presiding judge in her trial.
For a substantial sum of 10,000 francs, Joan was sold by John of Luxembourg to the English in November 1430. She was then transferred to their main administrative and military headquarters in France, the city of Rouen, located on the northwestern France near the Normandy coast.
And the English motive for this ecclesiastical trial was transparently political. English authorities wanted to discredit Charles VII by demonstrating that he owed his coronation to a witch, or at least a heretic. Bishop Cauchon himself, in the opening of the trial, declared his intent to inquire into acts, quote, contrary to the Orthodox faith, not only in our diocese, but in many others, end quote, committed by Joan. This trial was, from its inception, a political weapon meticulously disguised as a pursuit of religious justice. The ecclesiastical court provided the necessary veneer of legitimacy for what was, in essence, a state-sponsored character assassination designed to achieve a predestined outcome.
The charges against Joan, after months of preliminary investigation, were eventually distilled into 12 articles of accusation. These articles weren't primarily about her actions on the battlefield, but about the very nature of her faith, her claims of divine revelation, and her perceived defiance of church authority and societal norms.
Some of these articles of accusation noted Joan's certainty of future events and occult knowledge through her saints' revelations, such as identifying unknown men or a hidden sword. Others questioned Joan's preference for wearing men's clothes. Joan had apparently claimed that she was wearing such clothing by God's command, refusing to wear female attire even to receive the Eucharist.
Yes, the accusations in the 12 articles are a bit all over the place. They emphasized her act of signing her name with Jesus Maria and a cross, and of sometimes warning that those who disobeyed her would be killed by divine blows, claiming to act only by God's revelation. They also criticized her very action of leaving her parents against their wishes at the age of 17 to join the prince and wage war.
The last article reveals how much Joan's confidence and refusal to submit to their authority frustrated church leaders and theologians. Apparently, Joan continued to reiterate refusal to do anything contrary to God's commands and would not submit her revelations to the judgment of the church, only to God.
In essence, the charges painted Joan as a dangerous heretic who listened to demonic voices, arrogantly defied the authority of the church, and grotesquely transgressed against established gender norms, all of which were capital offenses punishable by death. The opening of the trial recorded itself framed her actions as, quote, utterly disregarding what is honorable in the female sex, breaking the bounds of modesty, and forgetting all female decency, end quote. And directly following that statement, it further condemns her, stating that Joan, quote, had disgracefully put on the clothing of the male sex, a striking and vile monstrosity contrary to the Catholic faith, end quote.
This construction of her crime was strategically brilliant for her accusers. It cleverly wove together accusations of theological heresy, such as claiming direct, unmediated revelation from God and challenging the church's interpretive authority. And it also noted charges of profound social transgression, most notably her adoption of male attire and her role as a military leader. The formal trial of Joan of Arc began on February 21st, 1431 in Rouen. Picture this scene: a young woman, barely 19, uneducated in the complex subtleties of theology and canon law, facing a formidable assembly of learned doctors, bishops, abbots, and lawyers. In all, some 131 assessors participated, almost all French, but all firmly aligned with the English cause. Joan stood alone. She had no lawyer to advise or defend her.
Despite the immense psychological pressure, the lack of counsel, and the overtly hostile environment, Joan's responses, meticulously recorded in the trial transcripts, reveals astonishing courage, native wit, and an unwavering conviction in her mission and her faith.
When asked the loaded question of whether she knew whether she was in God's grace, a question designed to trap her into either presumption or despair, she famously replied, quote, if I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest in all the world if I knew that I were not in the grace of God, end quote.
Regarding her voices and visions, she was unshakable.
Joan reportedly stated that, quote, all I have done is by our Lord's command. I have done nothing in the world, but by the order of God, end quote.
When repeatedly pressured about submitting her words and deeds to the judgment of the church, Joan made a crucial distinction.
She affirmed, quote, I believe surely that our Lord, the Pope of Rome, the bishops, and other clergy are established to guard the Christian faith and punish those who are found wanting therein. But as for me, for my doings, I submit myself only to the heavenly church, that is to say, to God, to the Virgin Mary, and to the saints in paradise, end quote.
On the contentious issue of her male attire, she remained resolute.
She explained that, quote, I would rather die than revoke what God has made me do, end quote.
She also offered a starkly practical reason for her clothing, a chilling indictment of her captors.
She said, quote, while I have been in prison, the English have molested me when I was dressed as a woman. I have done this to defend my modesty, end quote.
This claim of attempted sexual assault in prison was a serious matter, highlighting the dangers she faced.
Joan also presented a remarkably sophisticated theological stance for being an unlettered peasant girl. She refused to submit unconditionally to the church, that is, the earthly institution represented by the very court trying her. But she continued to affirm her submission to God, Christ, and the saints in heaven.
This was in fact a sophisticated stance, and as you noted, Elena, but it was also an incredibly perilous stance. By drawing this distinction, she implicitly challenged the absolute authority of Bishop Cauchon's court to judge the matters that she believed were directly ordained by God.
If individuals could bypass the earthly church and appeal directly to divine authority, then the church's role as the sole intermediary and arbiter of faith was fundamentally undermined. This, from the court's perspective, was the very essence of heresy. Her intelligence and what her judges called, quote, skillfully evasive answers clearly frustrated and angered her accusers.
Joan of Arc's trial, which took place February 21st, 1431, was riddled with flaws, even when measured against the legal standards of the 15th century.
The list of procedural irregularities and violations of canon law is extensive. There was a clear lack of impartiality. The court was packed with pro-English and Burgundian clerics. Bishop Cauchon himself had deep political and financial ties to the English. Joan suffered illegal prison conditions, and accused of heresy, she should have been held in a church prison guarded by nuns to protect her modesty and ensure fair treatment. Instead, she was kept in a secure military prison, chained and guarded by English soldiers, exposing her to constant threat and abuse.
We also can't forget that despite Joan's youth and ignorance of complex legal and theological arguments, she was effectively denied legal counsel. When Bishop Cauchon offered Joan a choice of advisor from among the very assessors who were part of the prosecution, Joan, perhaps wisely, refused, stating she relied on the counsel of her lord. Perhaps the most contentious part of the trial took place on May 24th, 1431. After being forced to listen to a public sermon and under direct threat of immediate execution by burning, Joan signed a form of abjuration, a document renouncing her visions and her male clothing.
The exact content of what she signed and whether she fully understood it is heavily debated. As noted before, Joan was mostly illiterate. Some sources even suggested that the document read to her was different from the one she marked.
Just days later, Joan found herself once again wearing men's clothing in her cell. Joan stated she resumed them to protect herself from sexual assaults by the guards, or that her female clothing had been taken away. Some accounts even suggest the male clothes were deliberately left by the guards to entrap her.
Upon this relapse, Bishop Cauchon reportedly exclaimed to the English commander, the Earl of Warwick, quote, "Farewell, be of good cheer, it is done," end quote. A chilling indication that a trap had been successfully sprung.
This charge of being a relapsed heretic was the legal linchpin for her execution. Under canon law, the first-time heretic who abjured could be sentenced to life imprisonment, but a relapsed heretic faced certain death. The entire sequence, the intense pressure to abjure, the highly suspicious circumstances of her resuming male attire, and the swift, final condemnation strongly suggests a carefully orchestrated legal maneuver designed to ensure her death while maintaining the facade of a due process. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was officially condemned as a relapsed heretic and handed over to the secular authorities for execution, as the church itself did not carry out death sentences.
And as we recounted at the beginning of our episode, Joan's execution in the Old Market Square of Rouen was a public spectacle, intended to serve as a grim warning and to solidify the verdict of heresy in the public mind.
The bailiff who had served as the executor of writs during the trial and accompanied Joan to the stake later testified at her nullification trial. He described her deep piety in her final moments. She repeatedly asked for a cross, and an English soldier, moved by pity, quickly fashioned a small one for her out of 2 pieces of wood, which she kissed and placed in her bosom. A formal crucifix was also brought from a nearby church and held before her as the flames rose.
Eyewitnesses, including some of the judges and English soldiers, were reportedly moved to tears by her courage and her final prayers. She died, it is said, with the name of Jesus repeatedly on her lips.
To prevent the gathering of any relics that might foster a cult of martyrdom, her body was ordered to be burnt 3 times, and her ashes were collected and thrown into the Seine River.
But the story doesn't end in the ashes. 20 years later, the political landscape of France had dramatically shifted. The 100 Years' War between England and France officially ended in 1453. Charles VII was firmly established on the French throne, and the English had been largely driven out of France. It was in this new context that a process began to re-examine Joan's condemnation.
This was the Nullification trial, also known as the Rehabilitation trial, formally initiated in 1450 and concluding in 1456. It was prompted by a petition from Joan's elderly mother, Isabelle Romay, and her 2 brothers, and authorized by Pope Calixtus III. The express purpose, as stated in the records, was, quote, to investigate whether the trial of condemnation and its verdict had been handled justly and according to ecclesiastical law.
An extensive investigation was undertaken. Around 115 witnesses were interviewed, villagers who knew Joan in her childhood, soldiers who fought alongside her, citizens of Orleans, and significantly several members of the original 1431 tribunal itself. Their testimonies painted a picture of Joan that was starkly different from the one constructed by her accusers.
The findings of the nullification trial were formally announced on July 7, 1456. They stated that the earlier 1431 trial and sentence were declared, quote, null, invalid, worthless, without effect, and annihilated, end quote.
The court found the original trial to be tainted by, quote, fraud, calumny, iniquity, and contradiction, and manifest errors of fact and of law, end quote. Joan of Arc was officially cleared of all charges and her honor restored.
The nullification trial meticulously documented the numerous errors of the first trial, the blatant partiality of the judges, particularly Bishop Cochon, the violent and intimidating conditions of Joan's imprisonment, the malevolent behavior of her guards, the use of insidious and trapping questions, the falsification of articles of accusation, and the abjuration obtained through extreme duress and likely deceit. A key finding was that the condemnation trial had deliberately excluded or suppressed eyewitness testimonies that would have been favorable to Joan, a grave procedural violation.
The nullification trial was not merely about correcting a past judicial error for Joan's sake or for her family's. It was also an act of profound political significance for King Charles VII. His reign had been irrevocably legitimized by Joan's victories, which were attributed to divine sanction. Her condemnation as a heretic and a witch, therefore, cast a dangerous shadow on his own piety and his right to rule. Thus, clearing Joan's name was also essential for clearing any stain from his own.
Joan of Arc's journey from condemned heretic to recognized saint was a long one. She was beatified by the Catholic Church in 1909 and finally canonized as Saint Joan of Arc on May 16, 1920 by Pope Benedict XV. Joan's story, her motivations, the true nature of her visions, these remain subjects of debate and wonder. Was she divinely inspired? Well, Joan clearly thought so. Did she suffer from some neurological condition? Some have speculated that might have been the case, even you, maybe, dear listeners. But most scholars find little evidence for such claims, noting she displayed none of the typical objective symptoms. Or was she simply a young woman of extraordinary conviction and courage in a time that desperately needed both? The crimes she was accused of, heresy, witchcraft, defying the church, wearing men's clothing, are not static. For her accusers in 1431, it was a clear-cut case, or at least one that they were determined to make appear so. For later generations, the crime might be seen as the profound injustice she suffered, or her courageous defiance of oppressive convention. Her story continues to force each era to confront its own definitions of faith, authority, gender, and justice.
Her story, raw and resonant, even after 6 centuries, forces us to ask fundamental questions. Who defines what a crime is? And when the powerful twist laws and religion to serve their own ends, who then are the true criminals in history's unforgiving gaze?
That's all for now.
Until next time.
Stay curious.